The noon sun hammered down on Redemption Creek, bleaching the color from the sky and baking the fine red dust that settled like a shroud on every surface tasting of grit and endings. For 5 years, Jedediah Jed Stone had breathed that dust, let it coat his throat and settle in his soul. It was the taste of penance. He sat on a crate in the narrow alley between the general store and the livery a ghost in broad daylight, whittling a piece of pine that would never become anything. His hands, once steady enough to draw and fire a colt in the blink of an eye, now moved with a deliberate, weary slowness. The world had become a thing to be observed from the shadows, a play in which he no longer had a part. A sudden sharp crack split the oppressive stillness. Not a firecracker, not a wagon plank snapping. It was the unmistakable report of a gunshot. Jed's head snapped up, his gray eyes, usually clouded with memory sharpening with an old forgotten focus. Another shot followed this one, punching a star-shaped hole through the window of the Redemption Savings and Trust. Screams erupted from the main street, thin and panicked in the dry heat. People scattered like quail, their frantic movements kicking up plumes of the ever-present dust. Jed remained in the alley, a statue carved from regret. This wasn't his fight. He'd hung up his U.S. Marshal's star the day he'd buried what was left of Martha and little Sarah. The law was a fool's game, a promise of order, in a world that craved only chaos. Yet his body remembered. His muscles tensed, his hand instinctively ghosting over the empty space on his hip, where his peacemaker had once rested. 3 men spilled out of the bank, their faces obscured by grimy bandanas. 2 of them carried heavy burlap sacks, their movements hurried and clumsy. But the 3rd man, the leader, moved with a chilling, unhurried grace. He was tall and lean, dressed in a dark duster despite the heat. He didn't carry a sack of money. Instead, he held a single object in his gloved hand. As he stepped into the brutal sunlight, a glint of silver caught Jed's eye. The town's aging Sheriff Brody burst out of his office, his face a mask of panicked determination. He was a good man, but he was a man meant for settling disputes over stray cattle, not for facing down professional killers. "Hold it right there," he yelled, his voice cracking under the strain as he leveled an old Remington. The leader of the outlaws didn't even flinch. He made a slight, almost imperceptible gesture with his free hand. One of his men spun around his shotgun, barking once. The blast tore through the air, and Sheriff Brody crumpled to the ground, clutching a leg that was suddenly a ruin of blood and denim. The shooter raised his weapon for a finishing shot, but the leader stopped him with another quiet gesture. Precise, controlled. This wasn't about chaos. It was about something else entirely. The leader walked calmly to his horse, ignoring the groaning sheriff and the money-laden men who were already mounting up. He stopped his back to the alley where Jed was hidden and held up the object he had taken. It was a silver locket, oval-shaped with a delicate floral etching on its surface. He polished it slowly, deliberately on the sleeve of his duster, making sure the sun caught its surface. The world tilted on its axis for Jedediah Stone. Time dissolved the heat and dust of Redemption Creek, fading away to be replaced by the cool scent of pine and the flickering warmth of a hearth. Martha's laughter light and free as she clasped the chain around her neck. "It's beautiful, Jedediah. Truly." The silver lay against the hollow of her throat, a perfect, shining promise. He had saved for months to buy it for their 5th anniversary. The etching was a spray of wild roses, her favorite. "I'll never take it off," she had whispered, her hand closing over it protectively. The memory shattered, consumed by a new one of fire and smoke. The smell of burning timber, acrid and choking. Flames roaring with a hungry demonic voice. He was fighting his way through the inferno, the heat blistering his skin, screaming their names. Martha, Sarah, He found them in the ashes. The fire had taken everything melted and warped and destroyed. Everything except the small, blackened lump of silver he found clutched in what remained of his wife's hand. The locket. A single, indestructible testament to all he had lost. Back in the alley, the breath left Jed's body in a ragged gasp. It couldn't be. That locket was buried with her resting beneath a simple wooden cross on the hill overlooking the ruins of their homestead. This had to be a copy, a cruel coincidence. But as the outlaw leader mounted his horse, he turned his head just enough for Jed to see his eyes over the bandana. They were cold, intelligent, and they seemed to look directly at him, a flicker of dark recognition in their depths. The man wasn't just robbing a bank. He was delivering a message. He was telling Jed that the past was not dead, that the graves on the hill were not deep enough to contain it. The outlaws galloped out of town, leaving a cloud of dust and the scent of gunpowder in their wake. The townspeople slowly crept out from their hiding places, their shock giving way to murmurs of fear. Jed felt a coldness spread through him that had nothing to do with the shade of the alley. For 5 years he had been a ghost, haunting the edges of his own life. But a ghost cannot be haunted. This cold precision, this personal targeted act, it was a summons. A summons from a past he had tried to burn and bury. He pushed himself to his feet, the piece of whittling forgotten in the dust. The numbness that had been his shield for half a decade was gone, replaced by an icy, familiar fire. Someone had dug up his ghosts, and he was going to find out why. The first person Jed sought out was Sheriff Brody. He found him propped up in Doc Blackwood's surgery, his leg bandaged, his face pale with pain and indignation. The air in the small room was thick with the scent of carbolic acid and whiskey, the latter of which Brody was sipping from a tin cup. Dr. Silas Blackwood, a man whose calm demeanor and precise movements always seemed out of place in the chaotic West, was carefully cleaning his instruments. "He's lucky," Blackwood said, without looking up, his voice a smooth, educated baritone. "The pellets missed the artery. He'll have a limp to remember them by, but he'll keep the leg." "Damn them." Brody grunted, wincing as he shifted his weight. Came out of nowhere, clean fast, knew exactly what they were doing. He looked up and saw Jed standing in the doorway, a shadow filling the frame. "Jedediah. Figured you'd have stayed hidden. Can't say I blame you." Jed ignored the jab. "The locket," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Did you see it?" Brody squinted, his memory fogged by pain. "Locket they took near $1,000. That's what matters." The leader Jed pressed, stepping into the room. He didn't take money. He took a silver locket from the manager's desk. Oval, etched with flowers. Blackwood paused his cleaning, his dark eyes resting on Jed with a flicker of professional curiosity. An unusual detail to notice in the midst of a violent robbery, Mr. Stone. Most men would be focused on the guns. It belonged to Mr. Abernathy's late wife, Brody, clarified, finally remembering. Kept it on his desk. Sentimental value. Strange thing to steal when there's a safe full of cash. They weren't just stealing, Jed stated flatly. He looked at Brody. They moved like soldiers, not outlaws. The leader never raised his voice, just used signals. They shot you to disable you, not to kill you. It was all clean. "Clean," Brody sputtered. "My leg feels like it's full of hot gravel." "You're alive." Jed said the words hanging in the sterile air. That was a choice they made. He turned his attention back to Blackwood. "Doc, you've been here a couple of years. Ever seen men like that pass through?" Blackwood finished wiping down a scalpel, his movements meticulous. "Redemption Creek is a quiet town, Mr. Stone. We attract farmers and prospectors, not disciplined tacticians. What you describe is an anomaly. He placed the scalpel on a clean cloth. Though I have observed a peculiar ailment spreading recently. Fevers, persistent coughs. Perhaps our little community is not as insulated from the outside world's troubles as we believe. The mention of sickness felt like a distraction, yet Blackwood's cool detachment was unsettling. Jed filed it away. They rode south, he said to Brody. I'll track them. Brody almost dropped his cup. Jed, you haven't worn a badge in 5 years. Well, no offense, but you're not the man you were. The man he was had died in a fire. This husk was something else. That locket was a message, Brody. For me. A message. How could a piece of jewelry from Abernathy's desk be a message for you? The sheriff's face was a mess of confusion and pain. Jed didn't answer. He couldn't explain the phantom weight of his wife's hand in his, the scent of burning pine that filled his lungs even now. To speak of it would be to give it a life he couldn't bear. Just deputize me, he said. Temporarily. Give me the authority to ask questions. A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the clink of Blackwood's instruments. Brody looked from Jed's haunted face to his own shattered leg. He was helpless. The town was terrified. And Jedediah Stone, broken as he was, had once been the most formidable marshal this side of the territories. All right, Jed, he sighed, the fight going out of him. You want to chase ghosts, be my guest. But you're not chasing them alone. Take young Deputy Miller with you. The boy's green, but he's eager, and he can shoot straight. I work better alone, Jed said. That's not an option. Brody snapped, his authority returning. You'll go as a representative of the law with a partner. That's my only condition. Miller will meet you at the livery in an hour. Jed gave a curt nod and turned to leave. As he reached the door, Blackwood's smooth voice stopped him. A word of caution, Mr. Stone, the doctor set his back still to the room. Revenge is a potent toxin. It creates a fever in the soul from which few men recover. As a physician, I advise against intentionally exposing yourself to it. Jed looked back at the doctor's ramrod-straight posture, the immaculate black coat, the hands that moved with the precision of a watchmaker. There was a coldness in him, a sterile emptiness that felt more dangerous than any outlaw's bullet. I'm not looking for revenge, Doc, Jed replied quietly. I'm looking for answers. He left the surgery and stepped back into the oppressive heat. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of orange and blood. The town felt different now. The sleepy quiet had been replaced by a watchful, nervous tension. Doors were bolted, windows shuttered. Jed walked toward the saloon, the one place where fear was always drowned, sold, or ignored. He needed a drink, but more than that, he needed to talk to Eliza. Eliza's saloon. The last chance was the beating heart of Redemption Creek. It was the only place that felt truly alive, smelling of stale beer sweat and sawdust. Eliza herself stood behind the bar, wiping a glass with a clean cloth, her sharp eyes missing nothing. She was a woman carved from hardship, with a cynical tongue and a core of pragmatism that Jed had always respected. Heard you were back among the living, she said as he approached the bar, not even looking up. Her voice was dry as a creek bed in August. It took a bank robbery and a crippled sheriff to do it. The town ought to send those fellas a thank-you note. Jed ignored the barb and slid onto a stool. Whiskey. She poured a generous measure into a glass and pushed it toward him. So the ghost of Jedediah Stone rides again. What's the occasion? Did they steal something of yours? You could say that he said, the whiskey burning a welcome trail down his throat. 3 men. Leader was tall, wore a duster, moved like he was above the dirt and noise of it all. See anyone like that come through? Eliza finally stopped polishing the glass and leaned on the bar, her gaze direct. A few strangers passed through last week, kept to themselves. One of them, though, he fit that description. Sat right where you are now. Drank water, not whiskey. Watched the room. His eyes were like chips of blue ice. Jed's grip tightened on his glass. He say anything? He asked questions, she said, lowering her voice. Subtle ones. Asked about the town's layout, asked about the sheriff, and he asked about you. The coldness in Jed's gut intensified. Me, what about me? Just if the stories were true. About the marshal who lost his family and then lost himself. Asked if you still lived up on that burned-out hill. Eliza's expression softened for a fraction of a second. I told him you were a private man, now best left alone. They knew I was here. Jed murmured more to himself than to her. The locket wasn't a coincidence. It was a calling card. This man, did he have a name? Never offered one. Paid in cash and left without a word. But there was something else. She hesitated, glancing around the now quiet saloon. He was talking to Doc Blackwood, right over in that corner booth. Looked serious. The doc's been a pillar of this community since he arrived, but there's a coldness to him. Seeing him with that stranger, it was like watching two spiders compare notes. Jed thought of Blackwood's sterile surgery, his precise hands, his chillingly calm warning about revenge. He'd dismissed the doctor's talk of spreading sickness as a non sequitur, but now connected to this cold-eyed stranger, it felt like a piece of a puzzle he couldn't yet see. Thanks, Eliza, he said, draining his glass and placing a coin on the bar. Jed, she called out as he stood to leave. He paused, his back to her. Be careful. These aren't common trail trash. When a man steals a memory instead of money, he's not after your gold. He's after your soul. He walked out into the gathering twilight, the amethyst shadows of dusk stretching like grasping fingers across the dusty street. At the livery, a young man with a hopeful face and a poorly fitting deputy's badge was waiting for him, holding the reins of two saddled horses. Deputy Miller, sir, the young man said, his voice brimming with an earnestness Jed had long since lost. Sheriff Brody filled me in. It's an honor to ride with you. Jed just grunted, swinging himself into the saddle of the powerful buckskin. He looked south into the vast darkening expanse of the desert. The trail would be cold, but the men he was hunting had left a trail of their own, making a trail of calculated violence that led directly back to his own past. He spurred his horse forward, the eager young deputy falling in behind him. They rode out of the dim lights of Redemption Creek, two riders swallowed by an immense and indifferent darkness. Jed was no longer a ghost hiding from the world. He was a hunter, and he was following the scent of his own history straight into a trap that had been 5 years in the making. The trail south was easy to follow, even in the fading light. 3 riders moving at a steady pace, not trying to cover their tracks. They weren't running. They were waiting. Jed felt it in his bones. He rode in silence, Miller's youthful chatter about protocol and tactics washing over him unanswered. The boy meant well, but he saw the world in black and white, law and outlaw. He didn't understand the shades of gray where true evil resided. They made camp near a series of skeletal rock formations that clawed at the star-dusted sky. While Miller tended to the horses and laid out their bedrolls with practiced efficiency, Jed scouted the perimeter. The air was cool now, and the only sound was the lonesome whisper of the wind. He found a high perch and scanned the horizon. Nothing. They were alone, but the feeling of being watched, of being led, persisted. He thought of the locket. Why that symbol? It was a private grief, a sacred token known only to him. To use it was to demonstrate an intimate knowledge of his deepest wound. Who could possibly know he replayed the fire in his mind for the 1000th time, a ritual of self-flagellation? The official report had called it an accident. A stray ember from the hearth, a gust of wind through a poorly sealed window. But he had always felt a sliver of doubt, a gnawing suspicion that the fire had been too hot too fast. An accelerant, maybe. He had been a marshal with many enemies. He'd investigated it himself, half mad with grief, but found nothing. The evidence was ash. The witnesses were dead. "Something on your mind?" Sir Miller asked, startling him. The deputy was holding out a plate of beans and jerky. Jed took the plate, his eyes still on the dark horizon, just thinking about the men we're chasing. "They made a mistake shooting Sheriff Brody," Miller said with conviction. "They'll hang for it." "They didn't make a mistake," Jed corrected quietly. "Every move they made was deliberate. The robbery was noise, a distraction. The real target was me." Miller looked confused. "But why? What would they want with a retired marshal?" Jed didn't have an answer, only Eliza's words echoing in his mind. "He's after your soul." They broke camp before dawn, and the sky a pale, bruised purple. An hour into their ride, they found the first body. It was one of the robbers, the one who had shot Brody. He was lying beside the trail, a single neat hole in the center of his forehead. His horse was gone, as were his guns and money. It was an execution. His own partner, Miller said, his face ashen. Why would they do that? "Loose ends," Jed said, dismounting to examine the scene. He was the only one who showed any sloppiness, any emotion. "The leader is methodical. He's cleaning house." The message was clear. The leader and the third man were the only ones who mattered. The others were disposable tools. They continued on the mood, now heavy with a more sinister understanding of what they were pursuing. This wasn't just a posse chasing robbers. This was Jed walking a path laid out for him by a killer of singular purpose and cruelty. By midday, the oppressive heat had returned. The trail led them toward a small, forgotten settlement called Haven, little more than a collection of sun-baked adobe huts huddled around a brackish well. As they approached, they saw no signs of life. No smoke from chimneys, no children playing, no dogs barking. A profound and unnatural silence hung over the place. "Something's wrong here," Miller whispered, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. Jed drew his own Colt, the familiar weight a cold comfort in his hand. They dismounted at the edge of the settlement and proceeded on foot, moving cautiously between the small houses. The first door they came to was ajar. Inside, a family, a man, a woman. 2 small children were slumped around their dinner table, their food untouched. Their skin had a pale, waxy sheen, and their eyes were open, staring into nothingness. There were no signs of violence, no wounds, no struggle. They looked as if they had simply fallen asleep and never woken up. Jed's blood ran cold. He checked the next house and the next. It was the same in everyone. The entire settlement was dead. Men, women, children, all victims of a silent, invisible killer. It's the plague," Miller stammered, his face a mask of horror. He took a step back, pulling his bandana over his face. "No," Jed said, his voice low and grim. He knelt beside the body of a young woman, gently tilting her head. He pointed to a small dark stain on the corner of her lips. And look at her fingertips. A bluish tint. He had seen this before years ago. A case involving a so-called chemist who was selling poisoned moonshine. This is poison. They walked toward the center of the small town, where the community well stood. A wooden bucket sat on the edge, half filled with water. Jed dipped a finger in and sniffed it. A faint, almost imperceptible almond scent. They poisoned the well. Jed said, the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. The sickness Blackwood had mentioned in Redemption Creek. The doctor's strange conversation with the outlaw leader. This wasn't a plague spreading naturally. It was a test. A field trial. My God, Miller breathed. Who would do something like this? A floorboard creaked behind them. They spun around, guns raised. A haggard old man stumbled out of the town's tiny trading post, his eyes wide with fever and terror. He was clutching a rusty rifle, but his hands trembled too much to aim it properly. Get away from the water. He rasped, his voice a dry crackle. It's the devil's work. We're lawmen, Jed said, holding up a hand to show he meant no harm. What happened here? The strangers, the old man coughed, a racking, painful sound. Came 3 days ago. Said they were geologists looking for silver. One was tall, quiet. The other was a doctor. Jed's focus sharpened. A doctor, what did he look like? Clean-shaven, dressed in black, carried a leather satchel full of bottles and glass tubes. Said he was here to study the water quality to help us. The old man's story tumbled out, a torrent of fear and confusion. He was friendly, gave the children candy, offered tonics to the sick. Then yesterday, people started falling, just stopping, like a watch that had wound down. I didn't drink from the well. I have my own rain barrel. I saw them. I saw the doctor pouring something into the well in the dead of night. Where did they go? Jed demanded. They left this morning. Rode north as the old man wheezed before another coughing fit bent him double. Back the way they came. Back toward Redemption Creek. The chilling realization hit Jed with the force of a physical blow. This place Haven was just a dress rehearsal. The main performance was scheduled for his town. The strange sickness there wasn't an accident. It was the beginning. It was stage 1. Suddenly, a shot rang out from the roof of the trading post. The old man grunted, a red flower blooming on his chest, and collapsed into the dust. Jed shoved Miller behind the well's stone base just as a second shot splintered the wood where his head had been. Sniper, Jed yelled, peering around the edge of the well. He saw him, the third man, the remaining outlaw, crouched on the rooftop with a rifle. He was there to silence the only witness. He was there to silence them. Cover me, Jed shouted. Miller, recovering from his shock, began firing his pistol at the rooftop, forcing the sniper to take cover. Jed broke from behind the well, sprinting across the open ground toward the side of the trading post, his boots kicking up dust from the silent street. He was out of the line of fire, pressed against the adobe wall. The sniper's attention was on Miller. Jed holstered his Colt and began to climb, finding holds in the weathered timber frame that supported the building's facade. He hauled himself onto the roof, moving with a speed and agility he thought he'd lost. The sniper was focused on the well, lining up another shot at the deputy. He never heard Jed approach. Jed kicked the rifle from the man's hands. The outlaw grunted in surprise and spun around, drawing a Bowie knife. He was fast, but Jed was faster. Years of training buried under layers of grief took over. He sidestepped the knife thrust, grabbed the man's wrist, and used his momentum to throw him off balance. They crashed to the rooftop together. The outlaw was wiry and strong, fighting with a desperate ferocity. He broke free and lunged again. This time, Jed didn't dodge. He met the attack head-on, blocking the knife arm and driving his fist into the man's throat. The outlaw gagged, his eyes bulging. Jed hit him again, a hard, precise blow to the temple. The man went limp. Jed stood, breathing heavily, the adrenaline coursing through him. He looked down at the unconscious outlaw, then over at the silent, dead town. This was more than a robbery, more than a personal vendetta. This was mass murder practiced and refined. He tied the outlaw's hands and feet with his own belt, then climbed down and went to Miller, who was staring wide-eyed at the body of the old man. "We have to go back," Jed said, his voice grim. "Now." "What about him?" Miller asked, nodding toward the roof. "We're taking him with us. He's going to tell us everything." They rode north with a furious urgency. Their prisoner slumped over his saddle, a rope connecting him to Jed's pommel. They rode through the night, the image of the dead town burned into Jed's mind. He finally understood. The bank robbery, the locket shooting the sheriff, it was all designed to get him out of Redemption Creek, to lure him away on a personal quest while the real plan unfolded. They needed him gone, the one man in town with the experience to recognize what was happening. And the architect of it, all the man who had visited Haven and tested his poison, was a doctor. A clean-shaven doctor in a black coat who carried a satchel of glass tubes. Dr. Silas Blackwood. The name settled in his mind cold and hard as a tombstone. Eliza's words came back to him. It was like watching two spiders compare notes. The clues had been there all along. The spreading sickness, Blackwood's detached curiosity, his presence in a town he claimed was insulated from the world's troubles. As the first gray light of dawn touched the horizon, their prisoner began to stir. Jed called a halt and dismounted, splashing water from his canteen onto the man's face. The outlaw coughed and sputtered, his eyes fluttering open. "Who are you working for?" Jed asked, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. The man just glared at him with pure hatred. "Your friends left you behind." Jed continued, gesturing to the empty landscape. "Just like they killed your partner. You're a loose end. Your only chance is to talk to me." The man spat a mouthful of dusty saliva near Jed's boot. "Go to hell, Marshal." Jed's eyes narrowed. He hadn't been called that in 5 years. This man knew who he was. "He told you about me, didn't he, Blackwood?" At the mention of the name, a flicker of fear crossed the outlaw's face before he could mask it. It was all the confirmation Jed needed. "You don't have to tell me the plan," Jed said, leaning in close, his voice a low growl. "I've already figured it out. Haven was the test run. Redemption Creek is next. Poison the town well. But why? What does he get out of it?" The man remained stubbornly silent. "All right," Jed said, standing up. He turned to Miller. "Ride ahead. Get to Redemption Creek as fast as you can. Find Sheriff Brody. Tell him Blackwood is poisoning the town. Tell him to post guards at the main well and any other water sources. Warn people not to drink the water. Go. Now." Miller, seeing the cold fury in Jed's eyes, didn't argue. He spurred his horse and galloped north, quickly disappearing over a rise. Jed was alone with his prisoner. He turned back to the outlaw, who was watching him with a new unease. "It's just you and me now," Jed said. "And I'm not as patient as the deputy. You're going to tell me Blackwood's endgame. You're going to tell me why he's doing this. And you're going to tell me why he sent for me with my wife's locket." He drew his Colt and cocked the hammer, the sound echoing in the vast silence of the desert. "Or we can just end this right here." The outlaw's bravado finally cracked. He was a hired gun, a killer for pay, but he wasn't a man willing to die for a secret. "You don't understand," he stammered, his eyes fixed on the barrel of the Colt. "He's not just a doctor. He's a fanatic. He talks about purification. A great experiment." "What experiment?" Jed pressed. "It's a 2-stage process," the man confessed, the words spilling out of him now. "He's already introduced the first agent into the water in your town. Did it days ago. A slow-acting compound. Makes people susceptible. The final dose? The completing agent. He's planning to administer it tonight. During the town meeting, he said the whole settlement will be there. Mass exposure. It will provide conclusive data. The coldness in Jed's stomach became a knot of ice. Prepared final batch for water supply introduction. The note from the original story had said, this was the same methodical evil. The locket, the robbery leading him away, it all bought Blackwood time to complete his preparations without interference. Why Jed demanded his voice a raw whisper. Why is he doing this to innocent people? It ain't about them, the outlaw said, shaking his head. It's about you, Marshal. It's always been about you. He talks about you all the time. About a town called Crimson Ridge. About a trial. About a fire. The man looked at Jed, his eyes full of a terrible dawning comprehension. He wants you to watch. He wants you to see another town die because of you. He calls it poetic justice. Crimson Ridge. The name hit Jed like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. It was the town he'd served in before being transferred. The town where a local assayer had been accused of running a medical scam, selling fake patents for miracle cures. The assayer had been convicted on the testimony of a young, ambitious town doctor who had provided the expert analysis. Jed had been the arresting marshal. He remembered the doctor's name now, a name he hadn't thought of in years. Dr. Alistair Finch. A man whose career was ruined when the assayer's conviction was overturned on appeal, revealing the doctor's evidence to be flawed, possibly even fabricated in his zeal for recognition. Finch had been disgraced, run out of town. Jed had heard he'd lost everything: his practice, his wife, his child. Jed stared at the outlaw, but he was seeing a different face. The face of Silas Blackwood, calm, professional, precise. Dr. Silas Blackwood was Dr. Alistair Finch, the man whose life Jed had inadvertently destroyed. This wasn't about research. This wasn't about a great experiment. This was a vendetta born in the ashes of one man's life and destined to end in the ashes of another's. He had to get back. He had to stop him. He hauled the prisoner to his feet and shoved him toward his horse. The ride back to Redemption Creek was no longer a race against a nameless evil. It was a race against his own past. The sun was a merciless tyrant in the sky by the time Jed saw the distant outlines of Redemption Creek. He had pushed his horse to its limit, the animal's flanks lathered in sweat. He'd left the captured outlaw tied securely to a tree miles back, with enough water to last until a posse could retrieve him. Speed was the only thing that mattered now. He thundered down the main street, a whirlwind of dust and grim purpose. The town was eerily quiet. Deputy Miller had obviously delivered the message. Guards were posted at the main well, their faces grim. But the real threat wasn't the water anymore. It was the man who had already poisoned it. He found Brody in his office, struggling to his feet with a makeshift crutch as Jed burst through the door. Eliza was there too, her arms crossed her face, a pale mask of anxiety. Miller told us, Brody said, his voice heavy. Blackwood, I can't believe it. He's been treating half the town. He has, Jed said grimly. With the first stage of his poison, the real dose comes tonight. The town meeting. Eliza breathed, her eyes wide with horror. It's for the Church Restoration Fund. Everyone will be there. He's the town doctor. They'll listen to anything he says. He could tell them he's giving them a tonic for the sickness, and they'd line up for it. Where is he? Jed demanded. He vanished, Brody said, gesturing helplessly with his crutch. After Miller raised the alarm, I sent men to his surgery. It was empty. All his personal effects, his advanced equipment gone. It was like he was never here. He wouldn't go far, Jed reasoned, his mind racing. He needs to be here to finish it. He thought of the most defensible, isolated structures in town, places a man could orchestrate a final, terrible act. The old clock tower, the derelict church on the edge of town. The church, Eliza confirmed. It's isolated, and the bell tower gives a clear view of the whole valley. He could see anyone coming. As if on cue, a low rumble echoed from the west. The sky, clear moments before, was now bruised with dark, churning clouds. A dust storm was rolling in a massive wall of red dirt and wind that would swallow the landscape. "He's using the storm for cover," Jed said. "It will sow chaos, drive people indoors, mask his movements." He checked the loads in his Colt. "Brody, get every able-bodied man you have. Surround the church, but don't approach until I give the signal. He might have the final poison rigged to a dead man's switch. We can't risk him releasing it out of spite." "What are you going to do?" Brody asked. "I'm going to have a conversation with the doctor," Jed said, his voice dangerously quiet. "This started with me. It ends with me." He turned to leave, but Eliza grabbed his arm. "Jed, don't. This is what he wants. He's a monster. Let Brody's men handle it." He looked into her worried eyes, seeing a flicker of the compassion she tried so hard to hide. "He's a monster I helped create, Eliza. I have to face him." He walked out into the rising wind, which was already beginning to howl, whipping dust and debris through the street. The sky was darkening to a sickly yellow-brown. The world was shrinking, visibility dropping with every gust. He made his way toward the edge of town, and the skeletal silhouette of the old church steeple just visible through the thickening haze. The church stood on a low rise, a monument to forgotten faith. Its windows were boarded up, its paint peeled by years of sun and wind. As the storm hit with full force, the wind shrieked through the gaps in the old wood, making the entire structure moan like a dying beast. Dust swirled so thickly he could barely see 10 feet ahead. Somewhere within that maelstrom of wind and grit, a bell began to toll, a slow, ominous clang that was almost lost in the roar of the storm. One clang, then another. A funereal rhythm. Jed circled around to the back of the church, keeping low. He found a cellar door, its hinges rusted, but the lock broken. He slipped inside into the damp, musty blackness. He moved by touch, his hand trailing along a cold stone wall, until he found a set of wooden stairs. He climbed them slowly, his Colt leading the way, emerging into the church's nave. The interior was a cavern of shadows and swirling dust motes, illuminated only by thin beams of the eerie storm-filtered light. Pews lay overturned, like fallen soldiers. At the far end, on the raised dais, where an altar once stood, was Silas Blackwood. He wasn't alone. The tall, cold-eyed outlaw leader stood beside him like a loyal sentinel. On the dais, arranged with terrifying precision, was Blackwood's laboratory beakers, burners, and a large glass carboy filled with a faintly glowing yellowish liquid. The completing agent. A system of tubes and valves connected it to a pump ready for dispersal. Blackwood turned a calm, almost pleasant smile on his face. He was no longer the unassuming town doctor. He was dressed in a pristine black suit, his posture radiating an unnerving sense of triumph. He was Dr. Alistair Finch, resurrected. "Jedediah Stone," he said, his voice cutting through the howl of the wind. "I knew you would come. Punctuality was always one of your virtues as a marshal." Finch, Jed said, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "Ah, so you remember," Blackwood, Finch said with a nod. "I confess I was worried the memory might have been cauterized, along with everything else." He gestured vaguely toward the windows. "This storm is magnificent, isn't it? A fitting backdrop for our reunion. The heavens themselves providing a proper sense of drama." The outlaw raised his pistol, but Finch stopped him with a raised hand. No, Marcus. Mr. Stone and I have so much to discuss." This is a moment to be savored. He looked at Jed, his eyes burning with a cold, intellectual fire. I must thank you, Marshal. You were the catalyst. The pressure that transformed a simple physician into something more. You murdered an entire town, Finch. Jed growled, his pistol steady. You're poisoning another. Correction, Finch said, holding up a finger. I euthanized a failed experiment in Haven. A necessary step to calibrate the dosage. Here in Redemption Creek, I am completing my life's work. A study in societal collapse precipitated by a simple, elegant chemical reaction. And you, Jedediah, have the best seat in the house. The church bell tolled again, overhead, a deep, resonant clang that vibrated through the floorboards. It was you, Jed said, the final piece falling into place. Crimson Ridge. The assayer was innocent. You faked the evidence to advance your career. Finch's smile widened. Clever? Yes. A minor ethical lapse in the pursuit of a greater good, my own advancement. But you, with your unbending, simplistic code of justice, you couldn't let it be. Your investigation, your report, it cost me everything. My reputation, my practice. His voice lost its pleasant tone, replaced by a raw, venomous hatred. My wife took our son and left. She couldn't bear the shame. They died of cholera in a squalid little town a year later. Poverty and filth, Jedediah. That is what your justice bought my family. He stepped forward, his eyes locking onto Jed's. You see, we are not so different. We are both men defined by the families we lost. You took my family with your law, so I'll take this town with my science. It's a perfectly balanced equation. A life for a life. A family for a town. The emotional blow was more staggering than any physical attack. Finch had mirrored his own tragedy, twisting it into a grotesque justification for his slaughter. Jed's guilt, the secret burden he'd carried for 5 years, was now laid bare by the very man who sought to punish him for it. This isn't justice. Jed said, his voice strained. It's the work of a madman. Is it? Finch countered, gesturing to the carboy. I see it as a reckoning. I'm offering you a choice. Your past has come for you, Jed. You can have revenge. He nodded toward his own chest. Kill me. Avenge the people of Haven. Avenge the impending deaths of everyone in this town. It's what the old Jedediah Stone would do. An eye for an eye. He paused, letting the wind's howl fill the silence. Or you can choose redemption. Save the town. But to do that, you need the antidote. And only I know the formula. He tapped his temple. The knowledge dies with me. The moral stakes were laid bare. His own personal vengeance versus the lives of hundreds. The outlaw Marcus watched the exchange, his pistol aimed at Jed, ready for the slightest move. The church bell tolled a relentless countdown. There is no antidote, Jed said, remembering the outlaw's confession. Oh, but there is, Finch said with a chilling laugh. A very complex one. Derived from a combination of rare desert herbs. Impossible to figure out before everyone here perishes in agony. He held up a small sealed vial of clear liquid. This is the base catalyst. Without it, the herbs are useless. And I assure you, I will smash it before you can take a step. The choice was clear. The path of the vengeful marshal or the path of the savior. He had to save the town. He had to break the cycle of destruction that he had, in his own way, started all those years ago. Jed slowly, deliberately lowered his Colt and placed it on the floor. He kicked it away. The antidote, Finch. Give it to me. Finch's face twisted in disappointment. How predictable. The hero, always choosing the selfless path. It's so tiresome. He looked at his hired gun. Marcus, It appears Mr. Stone wishes to be a martyr. Oblige him." Marcus raised his pistol to fire. But in that split second, as all eyes were on him, Jed moved. He dove sideways, grabbing a fallen hymnboard from the floor and flinging it like a discus. It spun through the air, striking the lantern that illuminated Finch's laboratory setup. The lantern shattered, spilling burning oil across the dais. Flames erupted with a hungry whoosh, engulfing the wooden platform and licking at the network of tubes. Finch screamed in fury, slapping at the fire that caught on his coat tails. Marcus, startled, fired a wild shot that splintered a pew next to Jed's head. Jed was already moving, rolling behind another row of pews for cover. Gunfire erupted. Glass shattered. Jed hit the floor. He scrambled through the shadows as Marcus fired blindly into the smoke and dust. The fire was spreading fast, feeding on the dry ancient wood of the church. Finch, his scientific precision lost to panic, was desperately trying to save his equipment from the flames. The bell above tolled faster now, its rope likely catching fire, the frantic clanging an alarm for the whole valley. Jed came up behind the last pew just as Marcus was reloading. He charged a wraith emerging from the smoke. He tackled the outlaw, driving him backward into the burning dais. They went down in a tangle of limbs and fury. Marcus brought his pistol up, trying to press it into Jed's side. Jed caught his wrist, forcing the gun away as the searing heat of the fire scorched his back. With a final desperate surge of strength, he slammed the outlaw's gun hand against the floor again and again until the pistol clattered free. He landed one solid punch and Marcus went limp. Through the roaring flames and thick smoke, he saw Finch. The doctor had retrieved the carboy of poison, trying to drag it to safety, but a burning beam had crashed down, pinning his leg. He was trapped, the fire closing in around him. Jed staggered to his feet, coughing, his eyes streaming. He saw the small vial, the antidote catalyst, on a small table just beyond the flames. He had a choice. Save the man who had destroyed so many lives, or grab the vial and leave him to his fate. He looked at Finch's face, contorted in terror and pain, and saw not a monster, but a broken man consumed by the same grief that had almost consumed him. He plunged through the edge of the flames, grabbing the vial, the heat of the glass searing his palm. Then he turned back. He grabbed the fallen beam, the wood burning his hands, and with a guttural roar, he lifted it just enough for Finch to pull his crushed leg free. Jed dragged him away from the worst of the fire, collapsing onto the dusty floor beside him. Sirens wailed outside the town's fire brigade. Brody's men were closing in. Finch looked up at him, his face a mask of smoke and disbelief. "Why?" he rasped. "Because this is my penance." Jed answered, his voice raw. "Not yours." He stood up, clutching the precious vial. The choice had been made. He would not become the man Silas Blackwood believed he was. He would not answer death with more death. As the church doors burst open and the townsfolk rushed in, Jed looked at the vial in his hand. Revenge was an ending. Redemption was a new beginning. The fire in the old church was eventually subdued, its smoldering frame a black skeleton against the clearing post storm sky. Silas Blackwood, his leg shattered, and his grand experiment in ruins, was taken into federal custody. His chilling confession of the events at Crimson Ridge Haven and his plans for Redemption Creek, ensuring he would never see the outside of a prison again. Before they took him away, under intense pressure from Jed and Sheriff Brody, he provided the full formula for the antidote, his final act one of bitter, unwilling cooperation. The falling action was a desperate communal struggle for survival. Guided by the formula, Jed and Eliza became the unlikely leaders of the town's salvation. They organized parties to ride into the surrounding canyons, seeking out the rare herbs Blackwood had described, the pale, root-like ghost bloom that only grew in shaded alkali flats, and the deep red fire moss found on sun-scorched granite. It was a race against the 48-hour deadline Blackwood's poison had imposed. The sick grew weaker, their symptoms worsening, but the community rallied. Those who were healthy worked tirelessly brewing the antidote in large cauldrons over open fires in the town square, the air thick with the strange, earthy scent of the herbs. Jed, his hands bandaged from the fire, worked alongside Eliza, grinding ingredients and measuring doses, his movements steady and purposeful. He was no longer a ghost. He was a fulcrum, and an entire town's fate balanced upon him. They administered the cure house by house, saving the very people who had once whispered about the broken Marshal on the hill. Slowly, miraculously, the fevers broke. The color returned to pale faces, and the shadow of death receded from Redemption Creek. Weeks later, a fragile peace had settled over the town. The near tragedy had forged a new, stronger bond among the survivors. They looked at Jedediah Stone differently now. He was no longer a specter of grief, but a symbol of resilience. He had walked through the fire of his past and emerged not unscarred, but whole. The final scene took place on the hill overlooking the town, where two simple wooden crosses stood against the vast blue sky. The air was clean, washed by the storm, and the scent of pine filled Jed's lungs. It was the first time in 5 years that the smell did not bring with it the choking memory of smoke. He knelt between the two graves, his hand resting on the cool, packed earth. He pulled a small object from his pocket. It wasn't the locket stolen from the bank that was evidence now locked away. This was the original, the blackened, fire-scarred lump of silver he had found in the ashes. He had spent days carefully cleaning it, polishing away the soot until the delicate etching of wild roses was visible once more. He didn't open it. He didn't need to see the tiny portraits inside to remember Martha's laugh or Sarah's bright, curious eyes. Those memories were part of him now, not as anchors of grief, but as a compass of love. He gently placed the silver locket on the earth atop Martha's grave, a final quiet gesture of letting go. He wasn't abandoning them. He was freeing himself. He had found a new purpose, not in the cold letter of the law, but in the fierce, messy, and profound act of saving others. He had not forgotten his past, but he had finally made peace with it, earning a redemption he never thought possible by forgiving the town, forgiving Silas Blackwood, and finally forgiving himself. He stood, his gaze turning from the graves to the recovering town below, a quiet sense of purpose settling in his soul. His long penance was over.